Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We are here at the PCA General Assembly in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we're really pleased to be sponsored by SHM Architects. We're at the booth here. Our good friend David Stocker, who is the S in SHM, has been a big supporter of the show over the years, and so we're really glad to be here in the booth, and we are, well, we're the Pugs, and I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, and I've written a number of books. I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Why don't we kick it over to you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and I'm at least one of the famous triad.
All right, Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I have my own 501c3 ministry, Every Square Inch Ministry, that's at esquareinch.org, and I just got back from doing a tour in Ireland, and I'm still jet-lagged.
All right, and we're joined by our friend Aaron Renn. Aaron's been on the show a couple of times, but it's been a little while.
Yeah.
And it's great to have you back. Why don't you introduce yourself, Aaron, and then we'll get into some fun stuff.
Sure. I'm a writer and consultant in Indianapolis who writes about culture, Christianity, and sort of men's issues. So sort of the intersection mostly of sort of future of the evangelical world and sort of the dysfunctions of society, particularly around men, and aspirationally how those overlap as well. But in previous life, I was an urban policy researcher, and before that, I was a management consultant.
Well, we're actually...
I should say AaronRenn.com. Go there, sign up.
There you go. All right. Well, thanks. And perhaps people would be familiar with your book, Negative World.
Yes.
And also basically the framework that you developed for interpreting kind of the situation we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah.
So I think it might be a good place to start. The last time we were together physically, we were at the Touchstone Conference, I think in Chicago. I think that's the last time we were together. And, of course, you gave an address there on the subject of Negative World. Basically, the conference was structured around the subject, Negative World. And the latest issue of Touchstone features your address at that. But I know you're kind of moving on to other things. But maybe you can give us an update on how things have been going since the publication of the book and maybe where you're trending.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, I came up with a framework for understanding the relationship between society and culture called the Three Worlds model, in a sense. It basically is based on this concept that although we never had a state church in America, for most of our history, we had a softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. And this began to become unwound in the 1960s, and Christianity's status in society began to go into decline. And I divide the period of decline of Christianity from roughly 1964 to the present into three phases or worlds that I call the positive, the neutral, and the negative world. Positive world, 64 to 94. Christianity is declining and yet still basically viewed positively. To be known as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society. The Christian moral norms are the basic moral structure of society. And if you violate those, you get into trouble. 1994, we hit a tipping point, entered the neutral world, which lasts from 94 to 2014. In the neutral world, Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. Then in 2014, we had a second tipping point and entered the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. That might be a better way to look at it. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society, and Christian morality is expressly repudiated, and in many ways is now seen as a threat to the new public moral order. And so this has been very dislocating, to say the least, to American evangelicals who have been used to thinking of themselves as a moral majority, if you remember the name of that old organization.
Right.
So I wrote this up originally in 2017 for a newsletter that I was going to shut down because it had so few readers. And somebody sent it to Rod Dreher, and it went viral then. So it really resonated then. Then First Things Magazine asked me to redo it and update it for the magazine. It was published in February 22 and went nuclear viral there. I think it's the most discussed article in the history of the magazine.
That's saying something.
Yeah.
That first thing's pretty significant.
Yeah, and then I turned it into a book, which was published about a year ago. Came out in January 24, I believe, with Zondervan, called Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in Anti-Christian Culture. And again, I got great response to the book. Actually, the response to the book was more uniformly positive than that to the article. I got some criticisms of the article, but by and large, I think the book did very well. And I still get invited to talk about this a lot. People still want to talk about this.
I'm afraid you're going to be stuck with the title, The Negative World Guy.
Yeah, it's not bad. I'm not per se moving on from it.
Right.
I think it's still a very valid framework to understand the world. I would give an update in this point. People have talked in the last year about a so-called vibe shift.
Yeah, I wanted to get into that.
I think that there has been a vibe shift in a sense in that what I would say is, I think most notably is that kind of the wokeness has gone into decline.
Yeah.
And most of the actual hostility from the negative world was as sort of a result of this woke complex that was really regnant in America from, say 2012, 2014 to 2024. Clearly that's in retreat. And so that's to the benefit of American evangelicals. Secondly, we are seeing a lot of interest, renewed interest in religion, including from, secular people like Joe Rogan,
Right.
who would have historically been very hostile to Christianity, had basically no Christian guests on his show, made fun of it when he talked about it. Now he's having Christian apologist on his show, and supposedly people say he's going to church.
Right.
You're hearing more about that. Even Richard Dawkins, the new atheist, now calls himself a cultural Christian, not because he believes in it, but because he says that, Christianity is a bulwark of Western liberal society, which he values. And so we've also seen, I think, indications that the decline of religion has halted among Gen Z. The amount of nuns is actually, no longer rising. And, this is very, very nascent, maybe within the margin of error, but certainly a little trend. And even church attendance is up among Gen Z. So I think those are all positive developments. But what I would not say is that we've moved into, a repositivized world or something like that. It's less negative, less hostile, but we still live in a definitively post-Christian culture. People like to focus on sexuality, and that's big, but just think about the mainstreaming of gambling and how, like, the sports leagues themselves are now partners in the gambling business. Think about pot legalization. Even though it wouldn't per se have been seen as a moral issue, but like the ubiquity of tattoos, that would have been something that would have been very kind of anathema to Wasp culture.
Right.
And so you start looking at our society, and of course look at the Trump administration. He's rolled, kind of eased off all the anti-abortion talk, and in some ways is one of the most liberal administrations that we've seen. So we're definitely. I would say this: if you try to do something, if you try to quote unquote legislate morality, it'll get negative very quickly.
Yeah.
Right.
Because, frankly, the society as a whole does not want to live under a Christian moral system.
Right.
And I think we've seen that definitively with regards to abortion and the votes since the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So I'll stop right there and kind of say that's where we've been.
Yeah, that's a great summary.
Glenn,
go ahead.
Toss something in here. What do you think about the trend that we're seeing of young men actually outnumbering women now going to church, but particularly the older, far more traditional forms like Orthodoxy, trad Catholics, and trad Anglicans?
Here's what I would say. I think kind of the Latin Mass stuff and the Orthodox, there's some of that, it's happening, but to me, this is somewhat like the idea of the return of the suit. It's like, it's a niche, it's a very niche thing. Probably statistically, it doesn't show up, although I hear a lot of young men are going kind of Orthodox. Here's what I see, yes. Traditionally, certainly for at least a couple hundred years, Christianity skewed very female. And I would say to this day, evangelicalism is essentially oriented around women and their preferences. And there's just an article in the Wall Street Journal about this church. It was on the cover of the Saturday Review section a few weeks ago about this church in Baton Rouge reaching men.
Yeah, I saw
There's
that.
a lot of good stuff in there that they were doing with these kind of working class people. But there was literally a section heading in there, Good Women and Worthless Men.
Right.
That basically summarizes how evangelicals think about men. And I could go on and I'll stop right there. We can come back to that topic if you want. But what I think has happened is culturally we've seen a polarization of gender in the younger eras, the younger generations. So women have moved far to the left socially and politically. Men, I don't know that they've so much moved to the right, but they seem like they've moved right because
Everybody else has gone left.
Everybody else has gone way left.
Right.
The women have. And so there's sort of a rising political polarization and cultural polarization by gender, including a lot of kind of battle of the sexes style hostility
Right.
between the sexes that we're seeing. And it's not just an American phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon.
Yeah,
it's
right.
probably most advanced in South Korea.
Right.
And it's also the case in European countries like Germany and the UK. And so, in essence, this is an overstatement, but for kind of Gen Z, sort of like the men are conservative, the women are liberal. And because religion is conservative coded, it's right coded, I think men are becoming more religious because it's bound up with a greater kind of set of cultural and political issues there. And so I think it's great that more men are in church, but I don't think we want Christianity to become a cultural or a political artifact. And I would also say, we don't want it to become kind of gender coded. Just because it's been too female, we don't want it to be too male coded either. But I think that's part of it. The trad thing, in my view, I think people talk about liquid modernity. People are looking for solid ground to stand on.
Yeah.
And so I sensed, especially the move to orthodoxy, as a product of a deep alienation from modernity and Western culture and from America itself. And it's really interesting when you look at the primary examples of the people who would come into the orthodoxy phenomenon. It's amazing how alienated they are. So let's take a guy like Paul Kingsnorth.
Right.
There's so many Paul Kingsnorth fanboys. I get in trouble every time I say something about Paul Kingsnorth, but I'm going to do it again. Paul Kingsnorth expatriated from the country where his family lived for 1,000 years. He adopted an essentially foreign faith. He lives essentially a primitivist lifestyle in rural Ireland, although online, as it were. He is deeply and explicitly critical of modern industrial society. This is a guy whose life, top to bottom, is characterized by a pervasive alienation from the world. Rod Dreher, I think it's notable, Rod Dreher also expatriated. He also had a crisis of faith in the Catholic Church. He also had a bad experience when he tried to go home. And again, I'm not saying these are bad things that these people have experienced or that's wrong, but like when you embrace orthodoxy, what you're basically saying is the West has failed. And therefore you're looking for solidity in another tradition. I think the trad Catholics, the Latin Mass people, have an element of that. I think the homesteading movement has a lot of that in it. And this is where I feel like Protestantism, Reformed theology is at a tremendous advantage because Protestantism is Christianity that is at home in the modern world. It created the modern world. Modernity is a product of Protestant Christianity, right? America is a product of Protestant Christianity. And you cannot, this idea that like the solutions to what ails us in America is to go live on a homestead and go back to some trad Latin Catholic thing where we're going to essentially go back to the Middle Ages or we're going to go back to the 700s looking for solidity. That's never going to be a viable answer for more than a tiny group of people.
Well, this is a good segue to get into some of your thoughts on evangelicals and elites. But why don't we quick? Yep. Just make sure you're talking to the mic,
Okay.
Tom.
Yeah, a little bit on that last point. There are also within, at least in Protestant theology, moral theology, there are questionable turns that strands of Protestant and evangelical theology have taken that have deviated from historic understandings of the doctrine of creation and have imported what would be lesser views than historic biblical orthodoxy. I'll give you an example. Oliver O'Donovan does an excellent analysis of the Anglican 39 Articles of Faith. And he says one of the uncomfortable things that is already showing up with that work is there is a gutting of the issue of creation. The nature of creation, its significance, its norms, its essences, its purposes had been eclipsed out. And he said this would be explainable just in terms of it being taken for granted if it wasn't the Continental Reformed who were engaging that and carrying that doctrine and arguing for it. But he talks about the way in which different strands, all the way up even to certain 17th century English-speaking Puritans, is it basically gets revised and altered, and so you're right about it contributing to modernity, but I think there's a lot of pushback even in the theological world saying that some of those turns weren't healthy because they flattened creation and made it more arbitrary and raw material. And because of that, some of the developments and the church going with those developments are starting to look like the byproduct of those turns rather than classic Protestantism in its earliest stages trying to carry on the riches of historic views of creation, nature's essences. Let me give you a quick example. The recent issues, even in the evangelical church, of not knowing what to do with the transgender movement because they've lost touch with what it means to be a human being in terms of soul-body unity, that a lot of them were caving to it or they were trying to accommodate to it, because they did lose touch with the historic Christian understanding that.
So let me just make a comment on that very thing,
yeah.
Tom. How much of that would you say is theological, and how much would you say that's no backbone?
Say the last.
No backbone. No guts.
Well, I think it's some, but teaching theology students, they don't know how to articulate it.
No, I understand. I understand that part of it.
Yeah.
But let's say we're talking about people that do have an awareness of what you just talked about.
Yeah.
I don't have the impression that they have the chutzpah, the guts, to stand up and actually do what you've described.
Do something. But I think those are all the kinds of, it's the lack of guts, it's the lack of courage, the lack of content, the lack of rethinking these through from our theological heritage that have made it attractive to people to go find places where they are.
No,
so I think that was just...
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, this I think plays into something I wanted to get into a little bit with you, Aaron, regarding some of the things that you're saying recently about elites and the failure, particularly of evangelicals, to sort of rise to cultural influence and prominence. You've reflected upon sort of the demise of the main line.
Yeah.
And I think you've made some really great points. But there's been a failure for evangelicals to fill the gap. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes.
Because I think this relates to the disillusionment.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, if there's one thinker I would like to promote the rediscovery of, it's the sociologist E. Digby Baltzell, who... He didn't create the term, but he popularized the term WASP, for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And he has a very unique take on the decline of leadership in America. Basically, he's sort of the, he died and his work was, initially developed in the 40s through the 70s. But he's very unique in how he analyzes elites in America and how he talks about that, which even going back to his original doctoral dissertation at Columbia in the 40s, you can see the problem of leadership in America, the decline of leadership, is something that he sees happening and is a big theme of his work. What went wrong in America? And so he talks about that in terms of the defects of the old WASP establishment. He was a big critic of them in many ways, although he was part of that group. And by the way, maybe the only elite theorist, maybe the only person who wrote about the Wasps who actually was a WASP.
Right.
And if you read any book about the WASP establishment today,
right,
it is written by a non-WASP who clearly has an axe to grind. There was a book called Wasp by Michael Knox Barron, I think was his name, came out not that long ago. I read it very early on. I'm like, this guy's either Catholic or he's a super, super disaffected WASP. And I Googled him, and of course, they brought up his New York Times wedding thing from a Catholic cathedral. So he was Catholic.
Right.
There's a new book called Flight of the Wasp by a guy named Michael Gross. It's, deeply, deeply, I'm not sure the word, very hostile, extremely, extremely negative towards WASPs in its characterizations. And so all of it, I think Richard Brookhiser wrote a book about the WASP. He was Catholic. And so you really don't have anybody writing about this who's on the inside. You can think about it sympathetically. Sort of like most of the critics of the 1950s were the dissidents of the 50s, the people who didn't like it. We didn't hear from the people who did like it.
Right. Let's dig into a little bit about what are your thoughts on why the WASPs were incapable of defending themselves?
Well, that's very, I would say, this is a little bit deviating from the public elite, but I'd say they had a couple problems. One was they had demographic change in the country that they were unable to figure out how to respond to, in essence.
Right.
And so they would not, it's to say, we were not going to allow Jews in our country clubs. We're not going to allow Catholics and Jews in our club, basically. So that became a problem when the demographics of the country have changed. And it's not, 1911 anymore. It's now 1960. And, we're electing a Catholic president of the United States. But you're still, there are like U.S. senators, who are not getting invited, who not being able to join country clubs, like Barry Goldwater, who was raised Episcopalian. He was only half Jewish. But like, even if you just had like
just
microscope, you couldn't get in. I can't remember the club. Whatever the big club is in Washington. Ambassadors from African nations were not allowed there because they were blacks. It's like, even people who reached the highest levels of society were still blackballed from things. Which, of course, those sorts of slights are very powerful.
Right.
And they also. So that was number one. Number two. The WASPs really emerged as we understand them in the post-war era as a product of the Second Industrial Revolution. And in essence, managerialization, etc. They were no longer people who were running companies.
Right.
It's now like the corporate CEO who's a professional manager. So they no longer had the economic clout that, say, John D. Rockefeller Sr. had, or Andrew Carnegie, or people like that. Far, far less of that. And then, of course, you had these kind of trust fund kids with really nothing productive to do and who were kind of feeling guilty about their money and all of that stuff. So they had probably a lot of defects in just their liberal theology and many other things that they had. But in essence, it is interesting. They essentially did, ultimately give up without a fight. I mean, they turned the keys to our institutions over.
I remember it.
To, okay, here's Catholics and Jews. Here's the key to the car. You get to drive. And one thing you'll never see is like some Catholic writer saying, "Wow, we deserve our fair share of the criticism for the way things have turned out in America."
Right.
Like,
Well,
you'll never see that.
Right.
And that was sort of like, what's his name? Joseph Bottom's book on what was his book? It was called like An Anxious Age or something like that. I keep getting his book confused with Jonathan Haidt's new book.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking about.
But his sort of thing, I'm like, why can't we just get like one Catholic guy like him who's like, maybe the Catholic moment didn't happen because we didn't deserve it and we actually aren't as good as we think.
Well,
those sorts of things are like bothersome. But I think and ultimately, like, we have completely different people running the country now than were running it in, say the 1950s when we were building the post-war security architecture. And you and I might not care about all that old stuff, but believe me, a guy like Joe Biden does.
Yeah.
And even the Washington Post was written about like, wow, there are basically no wasps in his administration.
Yeah,
a guy like Biden definitely is still nursing ethnic resentments.
Right.
And so there's a lot of this stuff there, but it's very complicated, all of what happened. But, the Wasps themselves were very defective in many ways, sort of as a class. They were, I think people tried to pin the blame for Vietnam on them, even though it was, of course, the Catholic, John F. Kennedy who got us into it. Even Lyndon Johnson and Nixon were not exactly wasps in the way that term was understood.
No, they're not. So let's think a little bit about, so we have personal history with WASP academics, people that we knew back in the day, who were a very different character stripe. They were liberal politically, but they weren't woke, you could say.
Yeah.
So I remember, like, Harvey Cox, he actually took a stand at HDS, Harvard Divinity School, against gay marriage. Right there when he was there. But he had, the standing to be able to do that. But at the same time, he wasn't pushing back hard. Although with Cox, he was actually very proactive in his recruiting of evangelicals. He wanted to bring in evangelicals en masse to the institution. This is one of the things people don't know.
It was an interesting time because I even remember lingering where the old ones always fighting kind of, being pacifist, fighting the kind of war machine.
Right.
And they were very critical of that and that type of America. But on the flip side, they did accommodate and they
played by a set of rules. They played by a set of rules that the other people didn't play by.
And they kind of looked like, you mentioned Dawkins and these other figures in different places, but they've kind of looked in that abyss and seen that's not where they want to go, and they have nowhere else to go but the strands they've criticized.
Yeah. Well, another feature, too, is and you bring this up a little bit, is the turning away from raising their children to pursue leadership.
Right. So a great example, Jeffrey Kaba Service, he, I don't know if he's from a WASP background himself. I assume he's Protestant. He wrote a great book called The Guardians, which is about the last generation of the WASPs. Kingman Brewster is the focus of his book. He was the president of Yale during the Vietnam War. He was the person who admitted, and also during the Civil Rights Movement, he's the one that admitted women to Yale and things of that nature. And, also McGeorge Bundy, which is a name that most people don't even know today, but he would, if you wanted to go with the best and brightest thesis about catastrophic WASP leadership, McGeorge Bundy would be a guy would be your poster boy for it. He was I think he was national security advisor for, was it Kennedy or Johnson, one of them, very involved in architecting Vietnam. He was the president of the Ford Foundation that turned it into essentially a malign entity. But the thing about Kingman Brewster is he was the 11th generation lineal descendant of Elder William Brewster of the Mayflower.
Okay.
And here he is running Yale University, okay, after 11 generations. And what did he do? He had 5 kids or something. He, in effect, disinherited his own children. After the changes he inaugurated, his children would never have the opportunities to have leadership the way that he had it. And so he's got a daughter who's a Hollywood actress. And so I'm not saying these are not successful people, but the Brewster line in public affairs is now extinct.
Yeah.
Think about that. 11 generations and
public leadership,
and then it just disappears with that one guy.
Yeah.
And I think that a guy like Rusty Reno would say those guys were fighting the good fight, and they just couldn't. Maybe I'm putting words in his mouth. They were trying to navigate all of this stuff like demographic change and second wave things that their previous generations had just not addressed, and maybe it was just hopeless for them. But I do think it's that odd. Who really, who could have a legacy like that and just say, none of my kids are going to have it. And, oh, by the way, they all basically burned up. Here's one thing. Here's a virtue that they had. they like spent down their family fortunes in public service. By the end of his life, this guy, Kingman Brewster, like, I think was like selling artwork to raise money. But I don't know if he was like, if it was him or if I'm getting him mixed up with Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. But there's another guy, like Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. spent basically his entire life in public service. He resigned his Senate seat to go fight in World War II.
Yeah.
You know, like nobody would do something like that.
Yeah, well, that's right.
And these guys never profited. You know, people like to complain about John Lindsay as a bad mayor of New York. He wasn't a great mayor, but like people are overly criticized from him. Like John Lindsay, by the end of his life, was bankrupt. Rudy Giuliani had to put him on the city payroll so he could have health insurance. These guys like literally spent themselves into the poorhouse in public service. Like not a single person anywhere in America does that today.
Right.
But then they sort of just, part of like squandering their family fortunes, like their kids had to go make money. Like that's part of why they couldn't go in there. So I think there's still a story to be told of what went on with these guys, and like how could you be the inheritor of 11 generations and it not be a priority that you have at least one child following your footsteps.
So Glenn, you wanted to say something a minute ago.
What I'm struck by is that in a lot of ways this looks like the beginning of the trajectory that ends with Joe Rigby's toxic empathy. That there are a set of ideals that they're looking at and they say, we say we believe in equality. We've said this for a long time. Maybe we need to start acting on it. But doing it in a way that disadvantages themselves rather than promoting others, which over time metastasizes into what we've got now.
One of the things, another feature is, you brought up military service. Serving in World War II. I think about like George Gilder. His father was a bomber pilot. He's part of the Tiffany, family, and he dies in the Second World War. And Gilder grows up in an environment where he's still a Brahmin. He's still part of that class. He goes to Harvard and does the whole shtick, and then. The reason we know about George Gilder today is he was willing to kind of risk it all by standing up to the feminists in the late 1970s and the early 80s, and then he transitioned into becoming kind of like a guru when it came to economic matters, popularizer. But anyway, that's what became of him. But when I think about, so I've known people in that social class. And they were really, I think, marvelous people just in terms of their personal lives and the conduct and so forth. But there was this failure to pass on the baton. And getting back to my earlier comment about, the main line is the sideline. And we have had an opportunity to fill the gap as evangelicals for the last 40 years, you could say, and we've not done it. What's going on in the evangelical world that explains our failure to sort of step in and become the new Wasps?
Well, here's what I would say. I have a lot of thoughts on that. First off, I think your average evangelical is completely ignorant of mainline Protestantism. They've never set foot in a mainline church, except maybe for a wedding. And they believe these are apostate denominations where every church is run by, a blue-haired, crazy lady pastor. And that's simply not true. Yeah. I mean, in fact, the PCUSA, this is a political, not a theological point, but it helps illustrate it. The PCUSA the majority of the people in the PCUSA voted for Trump in 2024. Like, you think, these are not,
right.
They're mostly old and boring. That's the problem. But there's tremendous amount of people who are basically theologically traditional, you would say, Orthodox. Even pastors, entire churches that are there, and so I think people don't really understand anything about mainline Protestantism. The other thing is, Protestantism was always stratified socioeconomically, ethnically, racially.
Right.
And so it was sort of like General Motors. When you started out, you drove a Chevy, then maybe you upgraded to an Oldsmobile, then you got your Buick, and finally when you arrived, you got your Cadillac.
Right.
You started off as a Baptist, and you became a Methodist, and you became a Presbyterian, and when you hit the C-suite, you're now Episcopalian. And so these mainline denominations, particularly Presbyterianism and Episcopalianism, were the religious traditions of the elite.
Right.
So that's number one. So evangelicalism was always a subaltern, the subaltern class. That's a one problem. Secondly, evangelicalism's roots and culture are still very shaped by fundamentalism, I would say.
Yeah.
And even so I'm a northerner, so we're here at the PCA General Assembly, and I would say my observation is in the northern United States, which is virtually every PCA church I've been to, none of these churches are materially Presbyterian culturally.
Right.
In fact,
they're basically Baptists who baptize babies.
Yes. I mean, for one thing is, the last PCA church, the PCA church in the town where I live, is 100% converts.
Right.
People. There's not a single person that was in the church that I'm aware of who was raised Presbyterian, except for one guy who's an elder, and he's from Lebanon. He's a third-generation Lebanese Presbyterian. But even the pastor grew up like me in a rural Pentecostal church.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, we have this Westminster Confession, but what is it really? It's a broad evangelical church. And I think they have to spend 50% of their time explaining to people who don't believe in infant baptism why they baptize why they baptize baby. Every time I read a book, whether it be Digby Baltzel or James Davison Hunter or Max Weber or anyone who talks about the culture of Protestant America, what is Protestant culture like? I'm like, this is completely foreign to American evangelicals.
Right.
Now, again, I do think in the South, where there are churches that were sort of mainline that left, the culture of the PCA may be different. So my experience with it has just been in the North. But I'm like, it's not, I visited, I was in Nashville before I came over here on Sunday. We visited Covenant Presbyterian.
Right.
And it felt very mainline.
Yeah.
And even their building, it's the only new church building that I've been in of any stripe that's Protestant that actually is a very high quality version of a traditional church.
Right.
I'm like, wow, I kind of like this church. So maybe the feel is very different in the South, but I think culturally it is essentially like subaltern, sort of, fundamentalist inflected,
Let's think about
broad evangelical culture.
Yeah, so let's think about Rusty Reno. So Rusty, we know Rusty.
Yeah.
I believe he was raised Episcopalian.
Yes, he's
And then Doug Johnson, who is also the editor at Touchstone, raised Episcopalian.
Yes.
They never would have entertained coming into the PCA.
Right.
They now, so Rusty went, Roman Catholic, and Doug went Orthodox.
Well, I think that's basically like the new escalator to American elite life.
Right.
Is you go, from Baptist evangelical, to whatever, but the last stop is not Episcopalianism anymore. It's either secularism or Catholicism.
Right.
That's become the new stopping point.
Right.
Certainly, if you're a conservative, you don't have to become Catholic. If you're liberal, you're probably just secular.
Right.
Or you may, in fact, actually attend an Episcopalian church.
Right. So like with our own Tom Price, so he's in the ACNA.
Yep.
Great folks over there, but you started Baptist.
Started out Baptist on Dad's side. That's where we went, and Lutheran on Mom's side.
Okay.
Didn't go so
but you
much.
identified more with the Baptists?
Growing up, yeah.
Because
Or
you're in
I
the
was
South.
forced to identify with the Baptists. And it was the fundamentalist strand. I mean, it was apocalyptic.
So you're not even
every
talking
day.
about this SBC. You're talking about independent
Yes,
fundamentalist
absolutely.
Baptistry.
Yes.
Right.
Falwell days. Yes.
So now but that's where you've ended up.
Yep.
So we've had a number of people come out of the PCA go into the
And
ACNA.
predominantly, most of the newcomers into the denomination are coming out. I get calls every day for people that are even ministers in Reformed Baptist lines who are going.
Yeah, I think ACNA is basically a denomination for ex-Baptists. It's becoming that.
Yeah.
It's also
Yeah.
extremely heavily convert-driven
Yes.
in the
Right.
United States.
Right.
And
church
I'm just
plant
like,
vision, yeah.
I have to be honest with you. I've been very skeptical of the ACNA project.
Yeah.
For a long time, when Keller was in his heyday, Presbyterianism was hot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now like Anglican has become the flavor of the month. And I'm just looking at this socially.
Sure. Yeah,
And I think the beauty of Anglicanism
Yeah.
as a kind of young you're like a professional class or like aspirationally kind of up there person. Here's the advantages of Anglicanism. One, you do get the smells and bells a little bit if you're into that. Secondly, is Anglicanism is essentially whatever you want it to be. 39 articles, Westminster Larger Catechism.
39 flavors.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a very broad tradition.
It is, yeah.
And it's much, much less prescriptive in what you have to believe, and therefore it lets you essentially, attune it to your sensibilities much more so.
I think that's a fair.
I think the other thing is like a lot of it's. Like, I think in the D.C. world, Anglicanism became bigger among certain people because I think many of the PCA churches in D.C., my understanding, seem to be very woke.
Yeah.
And very, so like for conservative people in D.C., the PCA probably doesn't have an appeal.
Right.
Whereas I think if you're in, depending on what market you're in,
right.
what the church landscape looks like. But if you go to Washington, you've got Capitol Hill Baptist, which is a very strong church. You've got multiple strong Anglican churches there.
Right.
And so I think that like the draw to Anglicanism is very powerful in a place like D.C.
Right.
So I think there's kind of a lot. There's a lot going on
and a
there.
lot of things. I mean, it depends on where you are too. I mean, location's big because a lot of the alternatives for the Baptist world with Converge International in Connecticut are where schools rented out, rock concerts, very thin kind of TED Talk type.
Just evangelicalism, generally speaking, in New England.
And
right?
so I think people who have any sense, especially a lot of the Baptists that are in the coming over, like in our particular town, the PCA Church also is another one meeting in a school, and it's not to say that's all bad.
Right.
Understand that's what do it. But some people who grew up and had a church building and had some of these things like mainline Protestants or even classic Baptists, they want something reminiscent of that. And at least, for example, with Anglicans, a lot came out of the Episcopal Church, they value those types of things.
Yeah, there have been some quite nice Anglican churches built that obviously spent a ton of money.
Yes.
Like Falls Church Anglican built a new church.
Yes, that's one of the really. Yeah,
you're spending a lot of money on the building. Whereas in general, I think the Reformed tradition in general is not about church buildings, to say the least. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard a pastor say this. The church isn't the building; it's the people.
So now
it includes the building.
It's like there's your creation. Just like the mentality. My point is like every single thing about evangelicalism militates against people who are marinated in that life ever accomplishing anything in the world. Like if I said my aspiration is to be on the Supreme Court someday, I would get like 10 lectures about idolatry. I'm doing a lot of research on this. Here's one you'll appreciate. First off, there is no evangelical elite. Evangelicalism has internal elites of its own world, but there are no external evangelical elites, materially speaking. Okay. No evangelicals in the Supreme Court. Is there a single evangelical president of a major university? How many top evangelical academics are there? You read these articles.
Only ones who study evangelicalism.
Only ones who study evangelicalism. There are a lot of evangelical business leaders, but they tend to be in like profitable but prosaic, low culture leverage industries like fast food and retail or stuff like that. They're not running media empires or tech firms. If you read about Christians in Silicon Valley in the New York Times, big article, wonderful. Every article's got the same 4 guys listed in it. It's like very thin. And so, in fact, I even did this thing. I asked a chatbot, tell me the top 15 living evangelical elites. All 15 people on that list were pastors or other professional evangelicals. Right. I asked the exact same question about the Catholic Church. Only 3 of the 15 were clergy.
Wow. Yeah.
So that the way that when you talk about the evangelical elite, like if you think about Carl Trueman's article in First Thing with evangelical elites, every single person thinks about, it's it's John Piper, or it's
Right.
Kevin DeYoung. It's,
Right.
They don't even think about it outside of those realms,
Right.
and it's completely invalid. So, I just reread for the third time Tim Keller's book, Every Good Endeavor, which is his faith and work book. And it's the most cited faith and work book there is, according to a sociologist who did his thing on it. And it's probably the most advanced, I'd say the most advanced version of faith and work. And so he gives, I think, if I recall correctly, 28 examples of people in faith and work situations in the book. None of them are what you would think of as someone doing elite things or aspiring to elite things.
Right.
The contemporary examples of people who are operating at the elite levels are negative examples. So one of them is the Murdoch family and the phone hacking scandal in the UK. Another one is a guy who took the money and ran after selling his serial tech entrepreneur who took the money and ran and then became the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. The closest thing to it is the guy, the Hershey chocolate guy, I can't remember his first name, who didn't lay anybody off during the Depression and engaged in public works in his town, which was great, but it's still sort of love your neighbor stuff. Whereas multiple of these examples are, I quit my high-powered job in finance to become a nurse, or something of that nature.
Right.
Or we had an investment opportunity, and it was for a company that the lead guys thought was not a good company, but he's like, well, I could veto this, but it's a good investment for our business. So what I'll do is I won't veto the investment, but I'll just forego my share of the bonus off of it. I mean, this is how faith and work is conceptualized. The paradigmatic story there is a woman takes a job at a company in New York, and she makes a big mistake very early in her tenure there, and she thinks she's going to get fired. But maybe her boss actually takes the blame for it. And he gets in trouble, and he loses influence in the company, and she doesn't lose her job. And she comes to him, and she's like, why in the world would you take the blame for me? He's like, well, I'm a Christian, and somebody took the blame for me, so that's what I...
Yeah.
But this is the conception of what it means to be in the workforce. And so I feel like totally the idea that you might actually be in charge of something and wield institutional power and shape and restate institutions, it's completely foreign to the evangelical mind and culture.
Yeah, the irony in this is that, if you look at Os Guinness, for example, where he talks about in his book, The Call, he talks about how in Catholicism, calling means calling into the clergy. In Protestantism, calling is much broader than that. And he says now that the Catholic heresy is this sort of extreme clericalism and withdrawal from the world and all of that. The Protestant heresy is going out and making money and, it's essentially a secular vision of the world. What you're telling me is that in practice, the opposite is what's happened.
Yes, evangelicalism is extraordinarily clericalist.
Yeah.
In its conception.
Yeah.
And it's much more clericalist than the Catholic Church, believe it or not. And that's not to say that there isn't a clerical world and papal politics and all of that. There is. But if you're Patrick Deneen or Adrian Vermeule or Amy Coney Barrett or J.D. Vance, you can just kind of you don't have to spend all your time worried about what they're doing. You know what I mean? You're living a parallel world.
Right. Now, the irony is I'm one of these people who moved in the wrong direction. I started as Catholic.
Yeah.
And, but when I grew up, my sense of the church was the clergy. And the church could exist without the laity. If you want to participate, you can, but really it's the clergy. That was sort of what I internalized growing up. That may actually prove to be an advantage. Because what that does is it frees you up to do what you're doing, and then you can go to the priest for confession and sacraments and things like that. But you can kind of do your own thing on the side.
Basically, the idea is if you're in the church, then basically you've got to be a priest or a nun or something like that. If you're going to do something else, you're going to go out into the larger world. Now, I want to explore kind of the social class dynamics of this, because I think that is a very significant factor. And I think some of the things that I see with evangelicals is a sort of self-deprecation, also self-sabotage when it comes to getting into certain settings. They're so uncomfortable and so self-conscious. Right. It's like they've got, 6 toes in each foot, and they don't want to take off their shoes. There's this sense of embarrassment and almost like an imposter syndrome. What am I doing in this setting right now? This is not the place I'm supposed to be. I shouldn't be driving this kind of car. I shouldn't have this kind of job. How much of that do you think plays into this? So you connect to populism. You talk about kind of the history of fundamentalism and evangelicalism. Can we get past that, or is that? Yeah, I think because it's so rooted in social class.
I think there's like a section of evangelicalism that thinks that way, but a way that I would model it is there's a term from I don't remember what academic field it came out of, called cultural cringe, and it was actually coined to describe Australia. And it's about the relationship to colonial culture, to the kind of the culture of the metropole. And when you were in Australia, you always had this sense that Australian culture was inferior to English culture. And we have some of that here, like more so than ever, candidly. Americans, like the Anglophilia that exists here, is sort of like anybody with a British accent seems a little smarter, a little posher, a little cooler, even if they've got like a middle-class accent from an English perspective. We can't tell the difference.
Yeah, that's right. Even for us, a Cockney accent sounds still kind of sophisticated.
Yeah,
Although
exactly.
Carl Trueman points out that in American movies, when you've got the uber villain, they always have an English accent.
Well, I think in the past, we've gone through different cycles of our relationship with England, and I think the idea that Americans would have looked up per se, it depends on the era. But I don't think that FDR was looking up to, to them for anything. No. So, but what I would say is, I think the same thing occurs with evangelicalism. You're an evangelical, you move to New York City, and basically evangelical culture is the inferior culture. And the culture of the society is the superior culture. And therefore, you essentially adopt the culture of the superior culture and become ashamed of your own culture. And there's very low cultural confidence there, in a sense, in a way that I don't think is true. And again, there is a class issue here, there's a culture issue, whereas this is something that Catholics don't suffer from this. This idea that Catholic theology is something to be ashamed of. It's no, I will aggressively promote distributism, or I'll promote Catholic social teaching, or we're unashamed of, being Catholic and what it means to be Catholic and our Catholic culture and our Catholic beliefs. They have much more confidence in that, in those elite circles, than evangelicals do, who I think are overwhelmingly, how do we fit in here? And I'm a huge fan of James Davison Hunter. Okay, so I want to say that up front. When I read his book, To Change the World, and I read the Faithful Presence thing, and I was living in New York when I read it for the first time, and I'm like, this is the strategy to make it in New York and be able to say I'm an authentic, fully faithful Christian in New York who never has to do anything that will get me in trouble. I can come here, try to be successful on Broadway or in finance. I can keep my head down. Again, love my neighbor stuff, if you will. And I don't have to do anything low class. I can just, this is great. Not only is it not only can I do it, this is the better option. I really think there is a sense in which there's extraordinarily low cultural confidence of the American evangelical, and to the extent that many of people who are, there may be more Protestant elites than you think in America. This is true of both mainline and evangelicals. Virtually none of them make their religious identity central to their public persona in the way that Catholics do. And so I think to me the cultural cringe is the issue, because people, and again, I'm shaped maybe heavily by New York, more so by my New York experiences. I feel like it's like not nobody in New York is going to fundamentally challenge the culture of New York, I think, in some way. It's extraordinarily affirmatory.
From the perspective of the Protestant, you're talking about Protestants?
Evangelical Protestants in
Right.
New York are extraordinarily affirmative of the culture, which, to be fair, I am too. Like, I like New York, and, I like urban, so I feel like it's a little bit, the fundamentalists would say we're coming to Sodom and Gomorrah, this is horrible, and,
Right.
and their approach is so like, what's his name? Francis Collins got a lot of grief for being the head of the NIH. Like, don't you know the NIH funded all this, this and that and the other thing? What you're basically saying is, yes, I'm sure there's criticisms that could be made of Francis Collins. I'm not lining up to extract, but Francis Collins is literally like a world-class scientist, okay? He's like an actual evangelical elite. And what you're basically saying is no evangelical could ever hold the position of head of NIH because you would have to be unfaithful in order to accept the strictures that would come with being in that position, unless you can, you have to be like a zero compromises person in sort of the political realm. Now, of course, ironically, the same people who love the Francis Collinses hate that sort of idea of that sort of prudential logic when it comes to voting for Trump. But I do think there's a sense of like, when you go into one of these domains, you don't always get you don't have the ability, many times legally, like to, if I were the principal of a public school, I'm going to be constrained to what I can do. And I think kind of the majority of evangelicals would say basically it's impossible to be a faithful Christian in that position. And so that wipes them out. And then the ones who take the job end up going native, basically.
Right.
So that's kind of our problem.
Yeah, I sort of felt that myself when I was at the university. By signing the contract and saying I will work for you, that requires me to abide by their rules, which limits what I can do.
Yeah.
But you have to learn how to function within that kind of an environment.
But it's interesting that when you're talking about, especially the kind of the worlds that evangelicals are in and how they're received, it was also worked the other way. I remember growing up in fundamentalism, the world was negative, and you were opposed to it. So any kind of compromises, there were no such things as Donovan once said, bonds of imperfection. They had to sort of be, you're separate. And then the world, sort of evangelical world, especially kind of the Falwell, the Liberty University, sold itself. It became neutral. And then the flip side became embraced. And then what was once oppositional, it still shows up in these places, for example, opposed to getting too much involved with the world in such a way that you have to make these kind of imperfect bonds, but you lose the capacity. Whereas like a Catholic who their understanding of creation and our participation in it, they're not going to work with those same oppositions that a kind of the fundamentalist psychology participated in, and I think still lingers around. But it is something, I see it in universities. It was a little different in UK because you did have some prominent evangelical thinkers rise to the top of Oxford University and other places, and they knew how to handle their own, and they were sort of respected for that. But you see much more shying away from it.
People like Alistair McGrath.
Yes.
Part of it is like when you're Francis Collins, it's not exactly this way. We don't really live in a meritocracy, but there is a sense in which the cream rises to the top. Why is he like the head of the NIH? Because he's like the world's best geneticist, right? Something like that, like genuine world-class, kind of Nobel Prize tier talent. Like, people understand, like, there's value there. I think another part of evangelicals we don't actually have enough of that talent. And that's not, it's, you got to have the talent, you got to have the ambition to want to do something like the Human Genome Project. And so we have to take advantage. The other thing is the Catholics, because of the Catholic Church's nature, there are a lot of very liberal Catholics. So being part of the Catholic Church does not instantly get you branded as like a reactionary conservative. Whereas evangelicalism today is in fact publicly perceived essentially as a political project.
Yeah.
It's basically viewed as Trumpist politics, at church, not entirely unfairly, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so, if you are, it's not hard to understand why, if you're in a place like New York City and there's all these extraordinarily vocal, hyper-confrontational, Trumpian in style people going crazy, that you don't want to be associated with. There is a sense in which, why doesn't anybody want to invite us to their party? Why does anybody want to partner with us? Well, you have to be the kind of person that people would want to partner with.
Yeah.
And when you're constantly putting everybody on blast all the time, nobody wants people. It's like that really limits what people want to do. So I think that's like an issue.
We need to wrap up. So anyway, if you were to sum up your aspirations for, you kind of hinted at a few things, but if you were to say, these are the 1 or 2, 3 things that evangelicals need to do, and we'll make this the kind of the thing to end on with the show, what would they be?
With regards to elite?
Becoming elite.
Yeah. So I think it's like, I don't think there's really much prospect of evangelicalism or its culture producing any sort of elites through any sort of self-conscious process. It's not like, if we just read James Davison Hunter's book, we can create some networks, and that's basically what they've been trying to do.
Right.
Is let's create some elite networks or some elite institutions. Let's create a college ministry exclusively for the Ivy League and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Truth is, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Because there's is it Peter Drucker? Who's the guy that said culture eats strategy for breakfast? And that's basically the truth. The culture is eating into strategy completely. I think it only happens organically through individual efforts of people who reorient themselves in that way, manage to free themselves from this culture, and somehow avoid becoming Roman Catholic. And so, how you do that, and people that you have to be able to understand that you will get no support from evangelicalism itself in this endeavor, and maybe even hostility.
Yeah.
But do it without the counter signaling. J.D. Vance doesn't spend all of his time counter signaling against Central American peasant Catholicism. We have to take, I think, a more Mitt Romney-like attitude to the world. I think Mitt Romney is actually a great guy to model yourself after. He has a sort of weird religion that everybody in America the guy got, when he ran for president, Robert Jeffress is saying he's a member of a cult. And think about all the hostility that guy had to endure. And yet, a track record of extreme competence in performance at this level. You know what his response basically to these attacks were? Whatever. He didn't get reactive. He didn't really ever. He's like, I'm not going to let these guys get under my skin. And I think that sort of aristocratic hauteur. A lot of people like to hate on Mitt, but I would say, look at Mitt Romney as a model of how to conduct yourself.
Okay, well, we should wrap it up with that. Anyway, thanks, Aaron, for giving us plenty to think about.
Thanks.
And it's been fun to see and fun to talk to you again. Anyway, we thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. And if you like what we do, there's a way to support us on Patreon. We, again, are happy to be sponsored today here at the PCA General Assembly by SHM Architects in Dallas. And if you're looking to have a church built, or if you're looking to have a home built, they're great folks to contact, and they do a lot of work outside Dallas, so you don't have to be located in Dallas for that. Anyway, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.